Songs about a church.
All right, we're rolling on episode 2 of this so far unnamed podcast. And today we have kind of an internet friend, Jedd Cole, who I met kind of a few years ago. I found his YouTube channel, The Electric Didact, which is awesome, and you should all check it out. We'll link it. But Jedd, I wanted to have you on because between your videos and what I see you posting on various social media, and I also understand you've written kind of a book of sorts, um, is you've kind of done a lot of reflecting on the way you grew up in a certain sort of religious dynamic or community, and you've clearly, like in some ways, moved past it, but you've also continued to wrestle with it, and so I kind of wanted to like bring you on to talk about that. So thanks for like being here on this little experiment as we still figure it out.
Yeah, I'm super grateful to be on here with you guys, and I really appreciate the invitation.
Yeah, so I guess I'll just kick things off with kind of to get the ball rolling. What kind of church did you grow up in, or like how did religion play in your early development and environment?
Uh, well, my church was pretty central to my family and to my growing up. The church that I grew up in, um, it was a couple different organizations, but they were all branches from the same tree, as it were, which was the Worldwide Church of God. Um, and Worldwide started back in like the 20s and 30s in various forms, and then and sort of um, had a bunch of schisms when the founder died in the 80s. And I grew up mainly in two of the sort of offshoots. One was an offshoot called United Church of God. And then when that church split, as when I was a teenager, I then went with the Church of God, a worldwide association. um, very interesting names, but yeah, the church always sort of whenever I was told how to describe it to outsiders, I was always told to say that it was non-denominational, um, which is obviously a very helpful term.
Yeah, it's always helpful. That's what I do.
Yeah. um, which but with hindsight, I think I would put it squarely in like a fundamentalist evangelical tradition. Is very much part of that broader movement in the US, especially.
Cool, cool. Yeah, it's interesting how non-denominational is either like more fundamental than normal, or it's just like weird hippie shit.
Yeah, it's such a nondescript description. I always thought that too. I always felt very dissatisfied whenever I was told to say that because it's like, but what does that mean? And
Hmm.
yeah, so my general tack was try not to talk about church with anyone who wasn't from the church.
Nice. Yeah. What kind of youth group did that kind of church have?
It really depended on where you were. The Our church was always kind of an old church demographically. Growing up, like it was usually the case that like my little sister and I were either the only kids in the congregation or like, two out of a handful, no more than four to six maybe. I grew up mostly in the South. So like I was born in California, where the church's headquarters and college was at the time. Both my parents went to that college, and then moved down to Mississippi when I was like two, And then when I was like 7, I think we moved to Arkansas, and I was there for like 10 years. So most of my growing up was in the South, and the congregations there where we were pretty small, um, very sort of close knit affairs, but like very little children, very few children. So like um, so it was often there was often no youth group to speak of. There when there was more than just my sister and I, there was occasionally an effort to do like a Bible class at church, like before church or afterward, where um, an adult would sit us down, and it depended. It varied widely, like what we did, but it was usually like we talked about a scripture, and then, or as was more often the case, we talked about like a fundamental doctrine and kind of went through the reasons why we believe what we believe, and then there was some kind of like arts and crafts type thing afterward. It was usually short and kind of not very involved. The only times when I had more involvement with more of like a group setting like that growing up was like our church observed these annual festivals um, that were part of a big part of our church's teachings was to involved like kind of co-opting and reinterpreting the Jewish holy days, high holy days, and in a sort of Christian um, perspective. And one of them in the fall, Feast of Tabernacles, was usually a huge event that was held at like various like predetermined feast sites throughout the country and internationally and stuff. And um, when we went there, um, I was usually told I had to go to the Bible classes that they had like a few times during the week long festival, and those usually had many more kids because there were hundreds, if not 1,000 or more
Mhm.
people at each given site. And so it was like either it was just a few of us and kind of boring, and like can I just go play full paper airplanes and whatever, or it was like a bunch of kids and it was chaotic and I didn't like it, um,
Oh boy.
for that reason.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Damn. So I know you mentioned that you're homeschooled. Did that so you didn't like it when there was a lot more people? You didn't think that was like a
No,
right
I mean,
way
like
to go about?
like I'm an introverted person and always have been, and um, so just for my personalities, from the standpoint of my personality, like I did not like big crowds. I often despised other kids because I was whatever, picky and not very outgoing and hard to please, I guess. Other kids were always like unruly, like I was like,
Hmm.
how do their parents let them get away with stuff like that? Because I was I was a very good boy at home for the most part, and kind of that was sort of part of my part of my identity for a long time.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, so being homeschooled, I was used to being either alone or with only a couple other people for a lot of the time, and um, yeah, I guess you get used to it.
Yeah, no, I feel that for sure.
The
Um, Sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say the homeschooling experience didn't do me any favors when it came to um, social skills. I'll just put
Mm.
it that way.
Did you have any other kind of social contact points outside of church, or were you kind of just the one or the other?
So my church put a lot of emphasis on like the phrase being in the world but not of the world.
Ooh boy.
Yeah, and we saw ourselves as the true church. That is, we had the we had all the right fundamental beliefs, and mainstream Christians, quote unquote, and what was the other term? Nominal Christians in the world did not have the right knowledge, and even if they had parts of it, they were still, they still held to wrong ideas about God or about prophecy, especially, or whatever, and or the afterlife and stuff like that. And so we were we took very seriously the idea that we were holy, i.e., like set apart from the world. And it's always boggled me as an adult, like, why my church wasn't like some kind of separatist monastic type thing where we all just like, because if you take what I was always being told, and our point of view, like, to its kind of logical conclusions, it feels like it would be easier to live um, if we had just been like a commune out in the woods or something.
Yeah.
But as it was, we were in the world, quote unquote, and so so that made pretty much all social encounters outside church kind of a fraught experience, really.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Um, and there was always just sort of like a sense of stranger danger growing up. Every time there was some kind of social gathering that wasn't church based. Like, for example, I remember going to like a family funeral for my great grandmother who died when I was young, and in Mississippi. And so the funeral was held, or like I think it was maybe the viewing was held, or memorial service was held at like a Baptist church there locally. And I remember us going and me just feeling really super, almost scared, um, being in a false church. um, and like and it's like a Southern Baptist thing, situation. So there's like, people responding to the minister as he's talking, and
Being unruly.
yeah, and that was totally verboten in my church. Like,
Yeah.
that was, that's what
Good
heathens
boy,
did.
Jedd just couldn't process it. Yeah.
No, it was very awkward and uncomfortable, and I hated it.
I'm
And
imagining you're really tiny and you're in a full like suit and tie in every single one of these anecdotes now.
I often wore a little clip-on tie, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
That makes it better, honestly.
Yes. I think my first like coat, my first like sports jacket thing was from a Goodwill store.
Badass. The last one I
Yeah.
got was from a Goodwill store.
Yeah, it was very ill-fitting, if I recall. But yeah, like there were a couple other things like outside of church that I remember. So when I was little, probably maybe 6-ish, we were in Mississippi, and I cannot remember what the means of this contact was, but I remember having this friend, a little older than me, maybe. Can't remember his name. and somehow I was over at his house a few times, just to hang out and play and stuff, and by myself. And he had like, like really blonde hair, and he had one of those like, what is it called with the like, it's not a with your haircut, it's like at the back of the neck, like they leave like a little bit of
Are
a
you talking about
tail of your
a
hair.
rat tail?
Yes, yeah,
Hell yeah.
yeah. And I remember he was super into Power Rangers, and I thought Power Rangers were cool too because I'd never seen it before because that's not something we would watch.
Mhm.
And um, my parents once begrudgingly let me like borrow his Power Rangers costume and wear it in the house.
Nice.
And but then and then like I remember like once maybe a sleepover type situation, like creeping into the living room to get something, and then like his parents were watching um, that movie Congo.
Oh,
Like
the Michael Crichton one.
I think so. Yeah, just like a
Yeah, yeah. It's like
um,
about monkeys who bash people's heads with rocks. I remember reading that book
yeah,
years ago.
yes, and and just thinking, just kind of being almost traumatized because it was like it was violent and scary, and the lights were off in the room, and I like didn't know what I was seeing, and
Mhm.
and then like the next thing I know, I was not allowed to see him again or visit him again because it was like I think it was more of a lifestyle thing. Like they let him do things and play stuff that they don't want me to be around. So
Yeah. Yeah, it's crazy that
um,
you mentioned Power Rangers because I was not allowed to watch Power Rangers.
me neither. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Um, no, it was not okay to watch, and I think that was probably just one of many things that added up to like,
Mhm.
okay, we're not gonna go see them anymore. Um,
What were you allowed to watch besides VeggieTales?
I yeah, VeggieTales was a favorite, but let's see. So we didn't have much money growing up, so like PBS, we would watch Bill Nye the Science Guy. Surprisingly, maybe.
Yeah, I was gonna say like actually like oh damn.
Yeah, so as I recall,
What was
like,
the role of Bill Nye the Science Guy?
Isn't it
Was he kind
pretty
of
like basic?
yeah, but
well,
it's
yeah,
definitely
I
were
mean,
your
he certainly
parents
wasn't. Sorry, go ahead.
I'm just wondering, like, were your parents kind of literalists when it came to
Hmm.
things like Genesis? Because that would, I vaguely
Yeah,
remember him having episodes that would kind of contradict that a bit. And I know that,
yeah.
like, Christian media did have, like, more Christian oriented, pseudoscientific
Mm.
kids media, but I'm just wondering
Yeah,
how that played.
so I can't really recall among my memories of the episodes we've watched. I don't really remember anything that went into that went really deep at all into evolutionary theory or anything like that. Because I think he was this, at least what we were able to see in my memory was mostly like chemistry and like weather and stuff like that. And there certainly wasn't, as I recall, like any discussion of like climate change or anything like that at the time. That was like the early 90s. And he certainly wasn't the sort of polemical guy he is now in that show.
Mhm.
But like, yeah, so like my family was very, our church is very literalist when it comes to the Bible, and believed that, for example, the universe was created over the span of 5 24-hour periods. Um, though with a twist, and I don't think they're the only evangelicals who do this, but like they do um, make this sort of uh, interesting interpretation of Genesis where like it's not that the earth was without form and void, it was the earth became without form and void. And so any like geological evidence older than 6,000 years is essentially from an earth or a universe that was created initially long before, but then was destroyed and made kind of a waste with like
Whoa.
the heavenly cosmic war between Satan and God and the angels and stuff. And then the creation account in Genesis 1 is essentially a recreation of
Ah,
You're
the
blowing my I've
universe.
never heard this.
No,
That's the
okay.
best shit.
Yeah. I think they call it the gap theory.
Okay.
So it's
Wow.
not like a fundamental teaching. And there were lots of people. I think there are probably the majority of people probably in the church probably are just straight literalists and don't really think about that.
Hmm.
But there are, a subset of people who are always kind of like asking questions and being like um, intellectual about it, quote unquote.
Hmm.
Um,
That's a
but
much
yeah.
more satisfying answer than a lot of ones I heard as a
Oh
kid.
yeah. Well,
Like
yeah.
that
And
probably would have caught me, and like, oh, that's what I believe now.
yeah. Well, that's what I thought too. When I heard it, I was like, oh, that makes total sense. Um, and like, yeah, and like my mom's pet theory, not really pet theory, but like I remember my mom saying like the dinosaurs were um, like Satan's attempt at creation, and all he made was ugly, and scary looking, and
Wow, they're rad.
yeah.
Non-dinosaurs.
I know.
that's that's such an odd way to brush them off.
Yeah, I
I've
know.
heard that though. I have heard that Satan put them in the ground. I had heard that like he didn't create them. He actually just put the bones
Mm,
in the ground.
like as a deceitful, like a
Yeah.
deception.
I've
Yeah.
heard that God put them in the ground to kind of tempt people away, give them a
What the
temptation.
fuck?
Like like literally like an intellectual trap. Like I've heard people defend
Yeah,
this.
I
Like,
think
oh
I've heard
yeah,
that too. I
yeah.
think I've heard that
Like
too at some
appearance of
points.
age theory, which at that point, like
Yeah.
God's literally setting us up to fail
I know.
by
Oh yeah.
misleading us. It's like I don't,
It's like the significant other that does like dumb little tests
right,
to make sure you're really loyal.
right.
Yes. No, but yeah, like uh,
In
our pers
comparison, it sounds like your parents had a slightly better approach. I'll give them that. The gap theory kind of like tries to,
yeah,
synthesize some things. So
yeah,
I've heard
yeah, if
worse,
you're
is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
right. It's as far as biblical literalist takes go, it's not, it's not maybe the most extreme of takes. But really, like, that wasn't something I encountered until I was like a teenager. So until then, I didn't really think about it. But our literalist point of view on the Bible meant that, yeah, science was sort of automatically sort of a danger zone. And so if there had been anything Bill Nye that was problematic, mom would be there like pausing it or muting it or whatever and going like, okay, so what's the truth about that, kids, and then we kind of recite what we knew.
Hmm.
Really, like, because we also watch like nature programs occasionally. Those were really more fraught because nature programs are always talking about animals the adaptations animals have and stuff like that. And um, that was watching nature programs growing up was more fraught for us. It was like on the one hand, like it was supposed to be safe because it was like, didn't have like sex and violence and stuff in it, except for animals eating each other. But we were supposed to be like appreciating God's creation, and so it was something we'd go to fairly frequently. But then it was always like whenever the host or the narrator or whatever was talking about evolution, it was always like an occasion for just like muting the narrator sometimes,
Wow.
or maybe like fast forwarding if it was a recording, or like making some kind of scoffing
Exactly.
remark,
Yeah. Hmm.
just to like signal like, yeah, that's not something I agree with, um, and stuff like that. But yeah, so but the sort of stepping back a bit, our approach about science and our views on creation and stuff like that was, as I understood it, like one big reason that we homeschooled. Because if we were homeschooled, mom could, and it was definitely mom, not my dad, participating in that. Mom could teach us, the truth about the earth and avoid anyone at a school or something giving us false ideas, about science and nature and stuff. That said, even then, so like the curriculum that we used was called Alpha Omega, um, and they are an evangelical homeschool curriculum publisher. So we had that going for us. But then also, they have like a Bible. They have like Bible curricula,
Oh yeah.
theology and stuff. But that stuff was not correct. It was
Oh yeah.
so we didn't take them up on that. So we just did, we got their science, geography, language arts and stuff, but we skipped anything they had with like Bible or anything because it would probably be riddled with errors. So that's kind of the links to which my family kind of went with regards to education. When I was a teenager, well, I guess a preteen, and then a little bit as a teenager, we had we joined a homeschooling like association, like group in the area. This was in Arkansas, and it was a association of Christian homeschooling families, that I think on a monthly basis convened at like a community center or something and organized like a lunch and like uh, extracurricular activities like you know bas- basketball or you know some sports items like that you wouldn't get as a homeschooler, and like a few like quote unquote classes
Yeah.
taught by volunteers and stuff like that. And it was just sort of a time to like hang out, for the parents to hang out and network, and for the kids to kind of meet each other and have a little bit of socialization. And that we did that for at least a few years, I think. And that was that felt pretty harmless. I mean, we were just kind of having fun together. We weren't like exchanging ideas or anything, so it didn't feel very dangerous. Even though uh, even though my mom complained that this was like the only association of its kind that didn't require like people to sign like a statement of faith, which
Wow.
she which bothered her because usually the statement of faith included doctrines that we would disagree with, um,
Damn.
like the Trinity was a big one. Like we didn't believe in a Holy Trinity, and
Really? What?
yeah, so we believed that the Holy Spirit was not a person, isn't a person. It's like a more like a material or a medium, um, and because it's not technically in the Bible, it was false doctrine, and so that alone kind of sealed off any real like association with other evangelical Christians.
Yeah, I was gonna say that's big in pretty much any denomination I've known. They're all like,
Yeah, yeah. Um, but as part of the homeschool group, were a couple of friends. Like the only other friends I ever had that were not in the church, really. A couple kids, a couple boys. Like one was, I think, maybe younger than me slightly, and then the other was a couple years older than me, and they lived on our street. We lived in Arkansas, and we met just riding bikes and stuff, and eventually just started hanging out a lot together, and really became good friends. For several years while we lived there, and but that was kind of like, and they were also homeschooled, and then they were part of this homeschool group. They were they were not really religious. I don't know if I mean, it was a Christian homeschooling group they were part of, but I don't recall them ever being like religious at all, so I'm not really sure what that
Yeah,
was about. But
it wasn't like a whole part of the home life, not really.
no, for sure. And but they were pretty. They were like the first sort of like harmless family friends that I remember, and sort of the last as well.
You
In
know,
terms
damn.
like spiritually harmless. It was just like it was just such high stakes thing, as I recall. Like growing up, it was so high stakes. You didn't want to, there's that verse in I think it's First Corinthians where it says, bad company corrupts good habits,
Oh boy.
and and that was harped on a lot because the idea was, if you hang around the wrong kinds of people, eventually you'll drift away from the truth, and it won't be it won't be something that you might be able to spot and control before it's too late. You got to just avoid
Yeah.
people.
And that puts so
Um,
much pressure on meeting new people because you have this list of doctrines and like things that you feel like you have to agree on.
well, it really actually it kind of for me, it didn't put pressure on meeting new people. What it did was incentivize me to just not meet new people at
Oh
all.
boy. Okay, yeah, that's a good response as well.
Yeah, so for me, it was like, okay, if I'm in church company, I'm safe. If I'm not, I'm unsafe. I'm homeschooled anyway, so I'm not really put in social positions very often. Um, so that kind of worked out in a way to keep me feeling more or less safe most of the time. And so what I was left with was navigating social life just in a church environment.
Hmm.
And because of that, like my family was pretty keen on trying to take full advantage of any like social stuff that the church was putting on. And so a big thing for me growing up was the summer camp program, starting when I was a teenager. Well, starting when I was preteen, I guess technically, because they had a preteen camp too. But they operated this camp system for teenagers, and that was sort of, other than like the occasional like big holy day gathering, like camp was sort of like the way to like make friends and like meet new people in the church as a teenager, because like I said, like depending on where you were, most of the time you didn't have many peers at church to choose from.
Yeah, damn.
Yeah, actually the summer camp is where I met um, my future partner, who
Oh, awesome.
like she and I met when we were 15, and like just became friends over time, long distance friends, and then like we never dated anyone else besides each other, and then
Oh,
just we
I
got
love
married.
that shit.
Yeah, it was like um, we were very like model members, you know what I mean?
Yeah, nice. I was gonna ask because there are a couple. I had noticed a trend in like my youth group. Like dating was kind of discouraged, but every now and then there'd be like one young like teenage couple. But that's they did it right. All the adults were like, "Oh, it's so beautiful." So that was you. I imagine that's you with your little suit and tie and your
Oh yeah,
perfect holy
The clip-on
relationship.
tie, yeah.
oh
Excellent. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, and being long distance, like there was no risk,
Yeah.
like
Exactly.
it was perfect.
Depends
If
on how
only everyone
creative you are.
I know. If only everyone could date that way. Like
Yeah.
never be around each other until you get married. Um, yeah, the the dating thing was weird. Like at camp, there was a lot of emphasis on gender roles, and um, like usually the first night of camp, the boys were separated from the girls, and they were each lectured to about sort of gender expectations for the week, and a lot of emphasis just on building, a holy righteous character, aka, proving you're man enough to be a husband and womanly enough to be a good wife,
Oh boy.
um, and having fun also. But like, yeah, I remember when I Kissed Dating Goodbye made the rounds in church. and Heather, my partner and I, Heather and I both read that book and both kind of took it seriously. Um, and uh, which I don't know if you're familiar with that book.
I'm
No.
aware of it through other people.
Yeah, so essentially the
My
argument is that modern dating is trash, obviously, and immoral and stuff like that. And what we should get back to is more of like a courtship model,
Oh boy, yep, courting.
and like, and all dating should be for the purpose of getting married. So it's high stakes, and you shouldn't take it lightly. Yada yada. And
funnily
essentially, you
enough,
basically just shouldn't be dating unless you're wanting to get married.
yeah, funnily enough, the author they haven't done a complete reversal, but they have sort of
Yeah,
backtracked recently
Wow.
yeah,
because I
I
think
heard of that.
they I guess they understand on some level that that view can also do harm
Hmm.
when applied inappropriately, and they kind of, from what I've heard, apply kind of a sledgehammer mentality when a scalpel is needed. And
Well,
and so
it was sort of like how we were sort of rewarded for that as young people. Like, as I recall, like it was- like
what do you
I
mean
made this up.
rewarded?
Well, so like there's a not in every young person's growth, but there's in many, as in my experience in the church, there was a point in a lot of young adults' development where they realized they could form sort of some amount of like moral authority or like score moral authority points. And usually that took the form of like, I'm going to take a more conservative position than everyone else on something I care about. Um, and I saw peers do that, and I did that, and in my experience, like for the most part, until you went over the line, like there was a person that Heather knew who like got to the point where he was arguing we should all wear tassels, and then got kicked out of the church. As long as you don't cross the line of hyper conservatism, like um, moves like that where you're like kind of taking a conservative stance as a young person and kind of being bold, like was often
Boldly
rewarded.
conservative. Yeah.
Yeah, it was often rewarded. I saw like by adults
Yeah. See,
who
my
kind of held
reaction.
them up.
Yeah. Oh yeah,
It's
yeah.
it's mistaken for wisdom, or at
Yeah,
least
yeah,
like taken
Exactly.
to be, you know, like it's that old assumption, that oh, you'll grow more conservative as you get older, and so they just
sure.
assume,
Makes you a wise
kids who
old
are,
soul.
yeah,
And it also
they
like
just
signals ownership. There was always an anxiety over young people leaving the church because it was just their parents' church or whatever.
Mm.
And
right.
if you go that far, you're signaling that like I'm owning this for myself, and you can rely on me,
Oh,
And so you end up
absolutely.
kind of getting points for young men, at least, in my experience, like for young men, doing that at a certain age could get you kind of points with like the pastors and the ministers and stuff to get like eventually get kind of rise through the ranks, as it were, of like church respect
Mm.
in the congregation. In my view, the I Kiss Dating Goodbye book. I mean, the guy was like in his early 20s or something when he wrote it. I
He was
think.
very young when he
Yeah,
wrote it. I remember.
is just kind of doing that, and then everyone thought he was so cool for doing that. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
What would you do with this newfound power? Because I had the same thought, but my thought was literally, okay, if I'm like overtly conservative in these areas, I have more wiggle room in other areas. Because they're like, I don't know about that, but he did this thing. So I was definitely coming at the quote unquote wrong angle there.
Yeah, I think for me, a lot of
That's
it was
just
driven.
politics, though. Like just compromise in one
Yeah,
area so you can
Yeah.
get an amendment on your own legislation, basically.
that's much more scheming than I was. I so deeply internalized the idea that I have to that unless it's my church, I would be in danger of spiritual lapse, and sinfulness, and also, I mean, I was a firstborn kid. I was a boy. I was introverted. I was very afraid of shame and very interested in getting validation from the authority figures in my life. And um, and so for me, being that person who could be like who could take like a radical conservative stance on an issue, sort of felt like the way to go. Like, if I'm going to be a leader, quote unquote, one day in this church, I need to be about this. There's an example. I was in my 20s. I think maybe shortly after Heather and I got married. I found myself in a dispute at church one day, between a friend of mine who's a little older than me and a middle-aged guy who I didn't like that much, admittedly, but I saw this kind of argument going on, dispute, and or maybe been one or two other people standing around too, other men, and I came over and they were talking about whether it was basically whether it was okay to kill somebody in self-defense.
Church
And
talk.
yeah, we were so my friend was saying no, it wasn't, because Jesus said to turn the other cheek if someone hits you and stuff like that. And then this other guy was saying, well, if someone if someone comes in threatening my family, like if someone had my family hostage or something like that, like I wouldn't hesitate. Like you gotta do what you gotta do. And I decided I would chime in and champion my friend's point to its extreme and say, the commandment says, thou shalt not murder. Um, and, Jesus said, turn the other cheek and all that. And I was saying there's absolutely no instance at all, regardless of the scenario, where killing would be justified or without sin. And um, and this guy just sort of scoffed at me. He asked like how old I was, and sort of made fun of me for my age and inexperience, and said I didn't understand what I was talking about, and then said eventually, like, I think God would forgive me in such a situation as he described. And I was just in shock, like, oh, that is so lukewarm, um, and we ended up parting with me feeling very like upset and kind of hurt because I was insulted.
Yeah.
um, so what did I do? I complained to the pastor in an email, uh, explaining the scenario and how it went and what I said and what he said. And pastor came back to me and was like, I think you said the right thing, and I'm going to talk with him. And I felt so validated for being the hyper conservative on that point, like for taking the stance of, well, if it says this, then it means that, absolutely. Um, and I feel like that's a case of, for me, where it was like, yeah, I'm validated and rewarded for taking the extreme conservative position. Um, so that was my experience with that, and I feel like that is a frequent phenomenon.
Oh yeah. Like,
Yeah.
especially when you have a pastor figure, their approval is a massive dopamine rush. All
Oh
they got to
yeah.
do is like agree with you, and you're like, yeah, that's it. Sometimes that's the end.
Oh, and then, but woe to you if the pastor rebukes you for
Oh,
anything, like,
exactly. Well, you got
as
to have
the
two hands, two sides of the coin.
right.
Mhm.
Damn. You've mentioned a lot about, I guess, interacting with people or like bad company being a spiritual downfall.
Mhm.
Was your church's views on salvation and eternal life, could you lose that once you got it? Is that the intensity of that pressure to keep good company? And
Oh, yes.
okay, weird.
Absolutely. So the official teaching was, yeah, basically there were different days of salvation, quote unquote. Um, what One of the things that made my church weird, one of the things, was that we were evangelical in the sense that we took seriously the commission to, in the Gospels, to preach the good news to all nations. Um, but we had we had a doctrine, sort of what I hold as like the major linchpin that made doctrinal linchpin that made us different, was our view of prophecy and the end, which included three resurrections. So there was, when Jesus comes back, there's going to be a resurrection of all of the saints, all of the saved people through time that worshipped God and had His Holy Spirit, and they would be instantly transformed into spirit beings, and join with Jesus in governing the earth for 1,000 years, the millennium. And at the end of that period is a second resurrection of everyone who has ever lived, basically everyone else through all of history, and they're all resurrected to physical life. And most of the time, we agreed that there would be like a period, maybe 100 years or a lifetime span or something like that, for people to learn about God's way and to have like
Okay.
a fair shot at accepting the truth. At the end of that period, there would be the Great White Throne Judgment of everyone, um, where there was a third resurrection of anyone else who had died during that whole period. And if you, basically, this was the last call. If you didn't accept the truth and worship God, then you would be destroyed. Um,
Damn.
the
That
Yeah,
seems pretty fair. I mean,
Yeah, you
I
got
mean,
3 tries. I'd be
yeah.
exhausted. Can you imagine getting revived 3 times?
yeah. Um, well, technically twice.
Oh yeah, yeah. I guess you're not gonna be a energy being and then die again. But yeah, But what's the
But
purpose of what's going on now then? Sorry, yeah, okay, continue.
yeah. So the upshot of that story is that there are two different periods of salvation. In the present time, we were taught, um, only God Himself um, saves people, and only God Himself calls people to be saved right now. So if you learn of the truth, if you join the church, anything like that, then you have been called, um, obviously, and you're responsible for what you know. So now you know the truth. So now is your day of salvation. You have to either accept it and live, or reject it and you'll die. You won't be resurrected in the second resurrection. The the Getting baptized is sort of the final, um, nail in the coffin, if that's the right metaphor. Maybe that's not the right metaphor. um, so if you're baptized in the church and then you leave, like, you're just sealing your own fate. Um, you're not going to get a second chance.
Ouch.
Um,
So there's a higher risk.
yeah. Um, so if you never come in contact with the truth out in the world and then you die, it's almost like you're better off, because then you get resurrected at the end when everything's okay, quote unquote, um, and then you have your real chance then.
Yeah.
But yeah, so being in the church, growing up in the church, you're automatically called, yes, as we said,
Yeah.
and yeah, so like once you're baptized, you're in it, or you're definitely not, if you leave.
That makes me so anxious. Oh,
For
You'll
sure.
get your chance. Don't worry.
yeah.
I'm curious if we can kind of like shift gears a little bit.
Yeah.
Sure.
You kind of grew up in what we might charitably describe as kind of a rather intense, like kind of church community. But my understanding is you don't really consider yourself a part of that at this point.
Mm.
So I'm curious, like, if maybe it was a process or maybe there was one or two major events, but like what made you start kind of to break off from that, and what was that process like for you?
Yeah, so it was sort of gradual until it was very very not gradual.
It kind
um,
of slowly built to something is
yeah,
uh,
so
yeah.
oops. So I took the church and its teachings very seriously, especially as I was entering like young adulthood. And um, I I was really as you said, like anxious to do the right thing, to not put my salvation in jeopardy. It was weird because I grew up in the church. Like my mom even grew up in the church. I was what we called a third generation Christian because my grandparents had been called into the true church as adults, and um, and so there was always anxiety that because of that I would take it for granted that it was, and even, older people in the church would talk in terms of that, like the young generation, is in danger of taking the church for granted and not really committing like they should. And I took that very seriously, because that was a message I was constantly hearing. And but I feel like one of the things that I really internalized deeply about the church's teachings was a sense of fairness. I was taught and shown, through various proofs, that God was a very fair God. That God was a reasonable God, in addition to being a loving God, and and that was very important to me. Um, the idea that God was arbitrary or capricious would have been really painful to me, and so the idea of fairness and justice was really important. And so I feel like with that as like a preamble, like part of what got me sort of, for lack of a better word, like wrestling with my faith was going to college, which is probably not a big surprise.
Did you go
But
to a public or private Christian college? Because that can make a big
that's
difference.
yeah, that's a good point. I went to a public college for financial reasons. We By the time I started college, we were pretty poor. We were in Wisconsin at the time, and I was able to get a lot of financial aid enough to start attending at like University of Wisconsin's like sort of small satellite community campus. Um, and uh, I went, and it was sort of a shocker, sort of shock to me to like confront actual academic rigor. I learned very quickly that like I'd been able to slide through a lot with homeschooling, especially through like high school stuff. Um, I was, I was, I was earnest enough and like hardworking enough to be able to adapt, I think, fairly quickly to like the demands of college. But college overall was like kind of a dive into the deep end of like the unfamiliar for me. somehow, I don't remember what my what my reasoning was. I signed up for a Philosophy 101 course my first semester, and there's nothing really that crazy about a Philosophy 101 course when you think about it. Most of what we covered was like logic, logical fallacies were a big part of it, and like making arguments properly and stuff like that, and which I just fascinated me, and that felt really cool to learn about. And but also like moral quandaries were a big part of the 101 class, and he would, the teacher would like separate the class and have one group take up one position and another group take up another on some kind of quandary or dilemma, and that kind of like that kind of was challenging in a way that I had not been challenged before, to kind of think critically about applying the values I allegedly held. And it I remember like one paper I had to write in that class where we had just read about some differing views on child rearing and like punishment and discipline, based on like the opposing ideas of like nature versus nurture. Like if kids are uh, naturally whatever, unruly, disobedient, need to be disciplined in certain ways, which was the viewpoint I was taught. And then like the idea that nurture had more to do with how kids behave. And stuff like that sort of started me like thinking about whether everything I took for granted was valid. Because I learned I learned through this, through our introduction to like logical arguments and stuff, that an argument could be valid in its form, but it could be also unsound, like just untrue. That it could look true, but actually not really be true, not line up with reality.
It can be persuasive without being true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that idea sort of, I feel like, stayed with me through the rest of college. Like, that was not something I'd ever thought about. And a year or two later, I was at the main campus in Madison, Wisconsin, taking a African American literature course, and realizing that I was sort of a racist. I had very like unexamined and very uncharitable perspectives about people who were not white, like me, and sort of going through the literature, which was itself challenging, and then going through like the lectures and discussion and stuff, like forced me to consider whether my good intentions had anything to do with the outcomes of my actions of my life. And because and it got me thinking about politics for the first time, because my church was a very like quietistic church. It took very seriously the idea that we were citizens of heaven first and foremost. We do not belong to this world, and so shouldn't. And because of our allegiance to the kingdom of God, which is not here yet, we shouldn't participate in politics overtly. And that included like voting, but it also included implicitly things like struggles for human and civil rights and stuff like that. And so the further I went through in college, sort of encountering these ideas, and especially learning about the radical unfairness of society, whether it was through, coursework in history or literature or philosophy or whatever, the more I started, the more I, the more I started getting confused because I knew that fairness was so important, justice was so important for me, and I supposed for God, that and if I could, without intending to, participate in systems of oppression, as I was learning about, where it had little to do with the individual actions of individual people, and more to do with like benefiting from and sort of passively um, consenting to a larger apparatus of injustice, say in the United States against people of color, then like didn't that mean something? Like shouldn't I be doing whatever I can to maybe mitigate that harm or try to correct it, even though from one perspective it was a very like earthly concern and not like one befitting of someone who's a citizen of heaven. And so those kind of thoughts are keeping in. I then took like a course. At the time I was like a teaching major. I thought I was going to be a teacher. I'm glad I changed majors. But before I did, I took an intro to ed course, which at University of Wisconsin was not so much how to be a teacher and more like an introduction to the stakes of education, the political stakes of education. And so I encountered people. They had lots of guests come in and stuff like that. I encountered people and writing about the plethora of social issues at play in public education, learning about poverty and homelessness and racism, um, and then learning for the first time about LGBTQ issues and queer theory and stuff like that. Which queer theory, I was like, oh, well, this is evil on the face of it because it tries to do away with categories. So that felt very like, finally a black and white judgment call I can make.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, which now as a person who is out as a bisexual, is like, Jedd, you thought you had it all figured out, didn't you?
Plot twist.
Yeah, I know. But just coming away from that experience feeling very, very passionately that issues of injustice, social injustice, were very definitely issues that God must be concerned about. And if God was concerned about them, then church should be concerned about them. And it was around this time that I got the opportunity to start contributing to the church's evangelism through writing. In 2011, I think it was, the United Church of God split, and another group was formed, the Church of God Worldwide Association, and my family joined that group. And as part of their like new sort of front-facing evangelism website, they were asking people to volunteer to like write blog posts and stuff. Just a second. And I thought that was cool. I love to write, and I felt pretty passionately about stuff. And so I decided to start writing. And very soon I thought I could try to share some of the things I had learned. in this new forum. And so like the first thing I wrote was sort of about the end of the world and or collapse of civilization, and it was like riffing on like a paper that was talking about that, and kind of just tying in scriptures to it. And then eventually I tried writing about um, like is there such thing as like just warfare around the time of like the CIA torture report coming out. My argument was no, there was no such thing as a good war. I did a couple different blog posts about like, does God allow free speech really? And my answer was no, because there were, you know, you shouldn't take God's name in vain. You shouldn't curse, obviously, and like you shouldn't be racist. Um, and was able to kind of like sneak in things about, say, unconscious bias or
Nice.
stuff like that. And
How were these received?
Yeah.
so so I say sneaking in stuff because I didn't want to admit it to myself, but I knew that the things I was wanting to share, the things I cared about, would be seen as liberal ideas, and that would have been uh, bad in my church. If it was liberal, it was sinful. It was just pretty much as simple as that. And and like even if as I wanted to argue, like even if it was liberal, like it could still line up with what God thought was right. Maybe the picture is more complicated, but I knew I had to be careful about it because a lot of church people read this stuff, and I could experience pushback, which I did. So there was.
So
Let's see.
I want to jump in and ask. So it sounds like you were kind of you said you were kind of sneaking it in partly because you didn't want to engage it yourself directly. Was this kind of a way of trying to engage with your own biases before you realized you were doing it? Am I like picking that up correctly?
Maybe partly. This is pretty much like that towards the end of my schooling, and while I didn't see myself as sort of um, having overcome whatever it was, implicit bias or stuff like, or prejudice or whatever, I was at the point where I was thinking this is stuff that people at my church need to learn.
Cool.
And um, and there was one that was like, what was it? I can't remember the. Oh no, it was. There was a news story about. I can't remember his name. It was like a NBA team owner who'd said some nasty racist stuff about some players, and he was having a controversy about it. And I riffed on that to talk about, is racism a sin, basically. And for one of my scriptures, I went to like there's one in James where it says like basically it condemns partiality, essentially. And I argued that racism is a form of partiality, and so God thinks it's sinful, and you should too. And I had all of these blog posts went by like a doctrinal committee, review committee, before they were published. And I remember for this particular one, I was told that there was some dispute about whether the scripture in James could be used to say that racism was sinful. And I defended my position and it went through. But it was the first kind of pushback I'd gotten where it was like, wait, why would they object to, to that kind of interpretation? Obviously racism is sinful, but it wasn't until eventually I wrote a piece at the height of the refugee crisis in Europe, um, about that and about turning away the stranger, which I felt very convicted about. I knew that a lot of people in my family, and people in the church, kind of were, being big Fox News folks, would be, were sort of against illegal immigration, and very critical of that, and like very uncaring, it seems to me, about the masses of people, desperately crossing the border, and trying to seek, better lives for themselves. And so I zeroed in on some scriptures in some of the prophets about, turning away, accusing Israel of turning away the stranger, the foreigner, and I was like, see, God condemns that as a sin, just along with everything else we think of as sinful. And all I said was basically, by conclusion, is like, maybe it's possible to like turn away the foreigner in one's heart, because
Okay.
I knew, I couldn't, even though I might have wanted to say like, so we need to advocate for political reform, to allow people to come here. I know I couldn't say something like that. That would have been absolutely thrown out. So I went with that, and I still naively kind of hoped that people would read it and be like, he's right. I should change my opinion and stop watching Fox News. And so that was published on a Friday. I don't think I've mentioned yet that our church worshipped on Saturdays, not Sundays. But so it got published on a Friday, and then went to church the next day. And minutes after I walked in the door, an older guy comes over, just fuming, and just starts confronting me about this article, about how wrong it is, about how I'm twisting scripture, and don't I didn't I remember that, like, in ancient Israel, like, people had to adapt to the culture and like adopt, the right religion in order to stay, like, and then talking about like Muslims and Germany, and don't you believe America is the is Israel, um and I was just kind of thrown back. I was totally like unprepared for that kind of in your face confrontation.
Yeah, because you tried to be
um
sneaky about it, and
yeah, and I was hurt. I was sort of verging on a panic attack. I was very sad and angry. And then church started, and we had to take our seats. and so church starts, and I can kind of barely keep it together. I'm like on the front row, as a good Christian ought to be.
oh, absolutely.
And mom taught me right. We were supposed to be on the front row. And the guy comes up to speak for the announcements, and he pulls out this piece of paper. He's like, so I was reading the blog last night, and one of our own members wrote this really amazing blog post. I think you all should hear. And he proceeds to read this blog post in full to the
Oh,
congregation. Um, and the minister in question is sort of a assistant, like an elder, who I think was not that popular in the congregation. Sort of a rambling guy, probably not the best speaker, and so people were kind of polite but not very fond of him. But yeah, so he reads this whole thing out loud. I'm just like, I'm probably either red or white, like, I don't know what I was, sitting in the front row,
flash
just
between
like,
the two rapidly, just in
yeah,
distress.
yeah. Feeling super embarrassed. He didn't let me know he was doing this beforehand. The service is finally done, and the first guy's wife comes over and like beckons me over to like talk with her, and she's like sitting me down, like we're talking, and she's like telling me about how all the illegals are like taking people's jobs, and like, are and crime and all this garbage. And I was just so tapped out. I was so sad and so disappointed. And I got back home and checked my email, and and the editor was like letting me know, like, okay, we're getting a lot of complaints about this from church members, including the following. And he like gave me some examples, like, ministers were disagreeing, regular people were disagreeing. It was becoming a big thing. And a few days later, the editor came back. It's like, I hate to say this, but we got to take it down. It's just causing too much controversy among people at church. And I just felt so depressed about that. It was like I knew that these ideas, as moderate as they were in hindsight, like we're going to experience pushback and criticism from the church, because I knew that they would be, kind of against popular opinion. And I knew that the church was pretty conservative, and I knew that people were pretty jingoistic sometimes. But then, so that was, I forget exactly when that was, but 2016 rolled around with the Trump campaign starting, and it felt like I was just seeing more and more just sort of outright sort of racist stuff being said at church or in Facebook, or even from the pulpit. Like the one guy who gave a sermonette that was like disgustedly, describing the high school class who was all taking a knee in a picture in solidarity with Colin Kaepernick against police brutality against Black people, and then he just outright called it satanic for kids to be taking a knee. That spirit of protest, whatever he said it was. I was at this point, it was like almost every week I was experiencing more and more like anxiety at church, and more like frustration with the sort of conservative point of view of my peers and the adults and everything, and feeling like frustrated because, to me, I thought whatever we think, it should be what God thinks is right. It shouldn't be ideological. And I was very naive, and so, but all my efforts to try to influence that were sort of rebuffed. And the thing with that blog post sort of became sort of the end for like my writing. I tried submitting one about like how a Christian should not react to gay marriage legalization.
Oh wow! Okay, so you kind of doubled down.
Yeah.
I was gonna ask, what do you write after that? Yeah, what's the follow up?
Yeah. No, that was the follow up. I took as my example a fundamentalist Christian group in I think it was South Korea, that had reportedly been violent at a pride parade. And that was like my counterexample, like, don't be like this, because that's not very Christian. And then the editor was like, I think a better counterexample would be better. Like, what if you talked about ISIS throwing homosexuals off rooftops?
Because it's not Christianity.
Yeah.
That's safe.
Like, oh, okay, so you want me to talk about how Muslims are bad, but not Christians?
Well, then compare those Christians to ISIS, and then get real spicy.
Just go for it. Yeah.
So
triple down at that point. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I did not triple down. Sorry to say. I gave up. I was like, okay, fine. Reject it. I'll move on.
How was your personal faith during this? Or was it so intertwined with the church's faith that this was just a horrible crisis?
It was a horrible crisis.
Yeah.
It was. Well, what I was coming to see was that, for me, my faith, faith was always about two things. It was about believing the right teachings, but it was also about like not sinning. And it was like, it was the things I was learning about social injustices and stuff. I reacted to those things by weaving them together into this idea of like not sinning. If we should, if the whole law, which was very important to us, the whole law of God can be boiled down as Jesus says, to love God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself, then how we treat other people, how we think of other people, how we talk about other people is of like next to supreme importance,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And it just, I wanted to bring these things to light and say like guys, maybe we should be doing essentially like a harder job, like a better job of being kind to our neighbor, like loving our neighbor. Maybe
Yeah.
it involves more than we thought. That was sort of my takeaway at the time. And to encounter such vivid resistance to
Yeah. Wow.
to stuff like, basic respect for someone of a different sexual orientation or gender, or like non-binary gender or something, or expressing a basic solidarity, even if you didn't take like a political stance, like to express a basic solidarity with, the illegal immigrant, or basic solidarity with, Black protesters in Ferguson, mourning the death of a neighbor. Like to me, these more than ever felt like the things that we were not doing as Christians, and like it felt very much in order for me to feel like I was being a good Christian, like it would have to involve at minimum, like doing those things. It would
So
mean,
you took it too seriously.
yeah, essentially I did. But I don't regret taking too seriously. It
Oh
was
no,
like
that's the right response.
what I was, kind of like what we were talking about earlier, is what I was encouraged to do. I was supposed to like own this faith as my
Yeah.
own, and I was sort of doing that, and it was getting me in trouble. And I eventually stopped writing because it was too depressing. I was having a lot of depression and anxiety about it, and I was talking a lot to my friend about it, and because we even tried to like write a letter of concern about the bias, the conservative bias on the website and stuff. And, this friend of mine and I were like sort of partners in crime about this, along with my partner, and so it kind of came to a head with um, really like the Black Lives Matter movement, when it became a big deal, and it became something that I cared a lot about. I thought was a very good thing, TM, and yet the church was very, pretty vitriolic about it when it did talk about it. And um, what I you may recall when I was describing this one guy's sort of in my face rebuke about that one blog post, he was talking about America being Israel. And I had known for many years that the church had a booklet called The United States and Great Britain in Prophecy. But it wasn't really high on my list of interests. It was kind of academic. It was kind of dry. I was supposed to read it at a certain point, like before baptism, and it was like a fundamental teaching of the church, but it didn't really seem to have much of an upshot. But in 2016, it kind of felt all of a sudden important, especially as this new group decided to start their own, publish their own version of this booklet. And they kind of made a big deal about it, and kind of made it to coincide with the presidential race and everything, for it to be maximum visibility and everything. But essentially, what the doctrine entails is that the United States and Great Britain are literally the descendants of the Israelite tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh, um, and that a bunch of European nations are the literal descendants of like a bunch of the other tribes. The Jews are the Jews are Jews, but everyone else became like some kind of nation state out in the world in
Okay.
modern times.
This is getting weird.
Yeah,
Yeah,
let's go.
I know. And
Oh my God.
so you can see how this is kind of like, yeah, whatever. When you're like a teenager,
You're
like
finding yourself, I think, in tension in some way. You're kind of. I guess I'm curious. Like, to what degree did you like realize a break at this point seems inevitable? Like, at what point did you kind of realize like
Because you put a lot of
there's
effort
no
into changing and like in help.
yeah, I held out for a long time with the hope that things could change, that I could
Yeah.
affect change on the inside. And my friend was staunchly of that opinion, still is actually, he's still in the church, and I miss him a lot. But he was always very gung ho about like, we gotta keep pushing, we gotta keep trying to um, offer critique and get the church to change over time, to sort of realize where it's wrong and course correct. And so I was hopeful too, uh, and I did have my doubts, but I didn't really run up into them until my partner and I decided we would write a letter of concern about this booklet, about this teaching of the U.S. and Britain in prophecy. Because according to the teaching, the great wealth and sort of imperial majesty of the historical United States and Great Britain are direct results of like God's blessing to
Oh
the
boy. Yeah.
patriarchs. And we read this, and we read the new booklet and realized like there's a racial aspect of this too. If they're literal descendants of the Israelites and they're
part of
conceived as like white,
part of God's blessing is good genes, I imagine.
yeah, well, good genes, but also like, what did that entail about like black people and like enslaved people? Were they descendants from ancient Israel? And it seemed like no.
Yeah.
um, so we kind of, and also this booklet like is just redonkulous. It's like it's
Really? Wow.
yeah,
Does it have
it
pictures?
what did you say?
Does it have pictures? Is it like kind of like tracked ish?
Yeah, it has like lots of like maps. I should say there's different iterations of the booklet because every offshoot from Worldwide has like their own version.
Mm-hmm.
The version I read from the United Church of God growing up had like tons of maps and stuff like that, like sort of tracing the paths of the lost tribes, to their current modern places in the British Isles and North America. And just loads of like really crazy arguments, like you can tell the Israelites were in Europe because look at the place names and stuff, like the tribe of Dan was all over the place. Look at the Danube River and the Dnieper and the like anywhere there was like place names where you could say like, oh, that sounds like an Israelite name, like that's where they were. British was said to derive from like the Hebrew Berit Ish, meaning like covenant man, stuff like that. Lots of like
They're
weird,
really pushing it.
yeah.
Damn.
And
I'm kind of sold actually. You just converted me.
Yeah.
oh
So
crap!
yeah. So
And
like
so we
it sounds like you and your partner were kind of from the beginning not on board with this.
no we well and we were like, it was sort of a non-issue up to this point. Like it didn't really have any bearing on our lives. It didn't seem all that important. We thought it was kind of a side teaching, that like some people thought was cool, but it was like not really important. But as we read, and as we heard people talking about the booklet and the teaching from the pulpit and stuff more and more that year, we realized the church saw it as a linchpin, like it was the key to understanding prophecy. And yeah, to the extent that like all the prophecies in, all the end time prophecies in the Bible, which there are lots, and we took them seriously and literally. Like anytime it says like Israel, it's basically talking about the U.S. and Great Britain. And
That's like legitimately spooky.
yeah, and we
It's
believe that
impressive in a way when you think about it. Like,
yes,
the
it
level
is.
of mental gymnastics, like
Yeah. But like we, we didn't usually talk or think about it that much, but like we believed that as a consequence of that teaching, that like the United States, before the end came, like the United States would be taken literally into captivity. It would be conquered by some outside force. I think it was supposed to be like, I think like a superpower in Europe or something like that. Was going to establish a world empire, and the U.S. would be like subject to that. And it was kind of like very real, scary conspiracy level stuff for some people. But we sent a letter, like a long sort of essay type thing, to our pastor about this booklet, telling him like, this seems like not correct, biblically and historically, and also it's kind of like a crazy time to put this out right now with like all this far right racist stuff going on, and we think it would be better off. The church would be better off if we didn't believe this. Like, what do we do? And he was like, well, you're wrong. And, if you really want to do anything, you'll have to write a study paper, which was a different thing.
that's
About
an odd response.
yeah. If you really wanted to make a critique, you have to write a study paper on the interpretations of the biblical scriptures themselves. Forget all the historical stuff. And so we did, and so this was like over several months.
Wow, you're committed. I love this.
I know, like this was the degree to which I was sort of deferring the question of my own faith. Like if we could get the church to admit that this was weird and bogus and damaging, and potentially racist, like then there'd be hope. Like we could work this out. It might take time, it might take hard work, it might hurt, but we could come out on the other side of this, the church as well. And anyway, long story short, over several months and lots of writing and increasingly thinking like this whole teaching is just absurd and does not make any sense. We sent this paper, it went up through like 3 different appeals of church hierarchy, and like it was ultimately trash canned, and the final judgment was a short email from like the ministerial board of directors, that said like, you think the interpretation is biased. Well, we think you're the one that's biased, and like you're
Owned.
Yeah, I know. And
they showed
also,
you.
but also, what really clinched it was because we had exhausted our channels for dissent, we were told that any further discussion of our doubts and concerns would be considered sowing discord among the brethren and was strictly forbidden.
You become the
So
bad influence.
I know. It's crazy. And so we were put in this position finally where it's like, nope, all your concerns are invalid, and if you talk about this anymore with anyone else, you might be kicked out of the church. So at this point, we were just dejected and just super depressed. This is where I started questioning everything, because I was really kind of at the limit of sort of what I felt I could even do to try to affect change, and live sort of authentically in the situation. And but we didn't really know what to do, because it's like, but this is the church. Is it worth like staying and just shutting up for the rest of our lives about something we really feel is wrong? But if we leave, like, where do we even go? Because it's like every other offshoot in this tradition is pretty much going to say the same thing. There is no like, liberal version of this church.
Did you consider completely going outside of that church?
Not yet.
Okay, cool.
Not yet. Yeah, we were sort of floundering, not knowing what to do, when my partner happened upon a archived article from our church, from the Worldwide Church, the original organization from like the 1950s. And she's like, Jedd, you got to see this. I can't believe this. And it was called The Race Question. And it was written during the time of, civil rights movement, uprisings and protests and stuff. And it was a church article, meant for its like evangelism magazine, so going out into the world. And it was making the case that discrimination may be wrong, but segregation is God ordained. And
Damn.
God separated the races in the beginning, and any attempt to mix them was sinful. Also, it was a communist plot, by the way.
Oh, yeah, of course.
And
Awesome.
and we kept reading. We were shocked. We were laughing because it was hilarious, and we were crying because it was like, oh no, what have we found?
Yeah, isn't that the mood?
I know. And over the next couple of days, we began pouring through the archives of Church of God material.
Is it all like online, or?
Yeah,
like...
so there's like 2 or 3 like private, like, I don't know, individuals or small groups that are so zealous about the original church founder, Herbert Armstrong, that they have created websites with extensive archives, just with everything. Searchable, like indexed, like it's great. If you're trying to uncover the nastiness that was this church in the 50s and 60s and 70s, they made it very easy to do so, unfortunately, or fortunately. And so what we found was the church had, in the 50s and 60s and 70s especially, a very, very robust, very racist set of teachings about God and race. The long and short of it is that God is white. God created Adam in his image, and Adam was white. Therefore, the Israelites were white, which meant Jesus was white, and like explicitly so, like not just like,
That's crazy. Yeah, I'd always.
White? Like,
was that?
They believed Arabs were white originally, and
no. Arabs are not white. Only Israelites.
Okay, so Jesus wasn't an Arab, I guess.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Mm.
And the races, God had put the races where He put them in the world for a reason, to keep them separate and to put them in their natural habitats, basically, made various biological arguments for different races being where they were, like in Africa or East Asia or whatever. Along with that sort of theology of race, these articles were just boiling over with vitriol against the civil rights movement, against protesting Black people, against poor Black people generally. We learned that eventually race was tied up in the vision of the end times and like the kingdom of God. So like eventually it was taught like Noah, who was perfect in his generations, is what the King James Bible says, which they took to mean like he was of the pure white strain. Noah had built the ark because the world had become evil through miscegenation, through interracial marriage, and in the end, when he's resurrected, he's helping God out in the kingdom. Noah is actually going to be like the enforcer of God's laws regarding race, and he's going to make sure people don't marry between races. And pursuant to that, the church had a very strict policy against interracial marriage, and then even went so far as to restrict fellowship between different races. So, like the Bible college they built starting in like the 40s, maybe late 30s, in which my parents had gone to, in the 80s, like was segregated purposefully with like a theological reason
Jesus Christ.
up until like the late 70s when they allowed 4 black men and 4 black women to attend max so that they could date their own kind.
Whoa. Oh my god. Okay,
Yeah.
so and did they? What were they? I assume you brought this up to them, or did you?
Yeah, so we emailed our pastor, which was, I'm not sure what we were expecting
Yeah.
at this point, but we emailed our pastor like saying, "Hey, we found this stuff. Please explain." We thought the church was not racist, was not like intentionally racist.
Yeah. Right.
So how do you explain this? And his response was, "Well, you shouldn't judge people of the past by the standards of the present."
Okay, so what are we gonna
Um,
do now?
I know, right? And also that it really wasn't racist because their intentions were good. And and yeah, he kind of dismissed it, and he kind of said he insisted that like the church changed direction by the late 70s, and reversed all that stuff. What we found, however, confirmed the opposite.
Mhm.
Like as late as like the 1980s, like the founder Herbert
Yeah.
Armstrong was like literally giving sermons about how interracial marriage was wrong and stuff like
Mhm.
that,
Did
and it
this?
was like, sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna ask. Did it kind of split? I guess your faith of how you saw God and how we should act. You realizing is completely separate from what your church is thinking, and is was I in my mind I would go one of two directions. One, either okay, the church they have God, they have the right idea of what God is. I'm just done. Like that's
Mm,
not real. Peace out. Or I guess yeah, the idea of trying to find something like, oh, I'm gonna find someone else that believes that you should actually follow. I guess the spirit of the message. And
mm. Well, I was I was I was confused. I was
fair,
I
it's
was
a fair thing to
I
be.
was sort of two minds. I had lots of doubts going on. By this point, I felt very done with the church for sure, the organization.
Hmm.
I felt it would be intellectually dishonest of me to continue, accepting what they were preaching and teaching. It would be morally dishonest of me too. And by this time I had been casting about looking for Christian counter interpretations, Christian messages on, anti-racism and ways to interpret the Bible less literally, and like more like liberal leaning Christian sort of
Yeah.
interpretations of politics and stuff like that. Because I was becoming aware that they were out there and curious at this point. Like, well, is there a Christianity that is more on track in these regards. That isn't racist and isn't, radically conservative to the point of just hating people for who they are and all this stuff. And by this time too, I was also sort of feeling starting to become more of like an anti-capitalist think in my thinking and stuff like that. And so that was also part of that kind of searching about for stuff. And so like I by this point I was done with the idea that the Bible was literally inspired. But like there was
Did you still believe in God, essentially?
Yeah. Yeah. And the problem was, so we basically at this point we left. It was awkward because you don't like walk out of the church building.
Just
You just
throw your clip-on
just
top
stop
into
going.
the pulpit.
Yeah. So we decided to stop going because we couldn't go to there anymore, just for our conscience sake.
Yeah.
But then it was like, what do we do now? Because we still didn't, we still had sort of doctrinal like investment. We still had like investments in certain teachings that we learned. Like every other church still believes in like the Trinity. Like how are we going to get over that? And like no other church believes in like these resurrections that like allow for the possibility of like everyone to be saved and right and like so we didn't know what to do. We like went to a couple other like offshoots that we were curious about in the same like tradition. One of them we went and it was kind of weird, and then they started the service, and then they start instead of a sermon they decided to play this like ultra nationalist documentary about God God's blessing
Oh
on the United
boy.
States, and we're like, okay, and then we left in the middle
Yeah,
of service.
peace.
And then um and then we went to another group like, oh man, like an hour and a half away or something like that,
Committed.
and it was like you know like six very old people who were just tickled that two young people were there,
Oh boy.
and like but very like moribund and very like this is basically the same thing. And then we went to like another one. It was like yeah, like less than 10 people in like an office corner of like an office building. And then like on the announcement table they had like a petition that was like against Colin Kaepernick's protest in the NFL and
Oh
stuff like
boy.
that. And
Oh
we're
my
like, oh
gosh.
great. So we gave up pretty soon on
Yeah.
finding like another offshoot within this tradition that wouldn't be a conflict with our conscience.
Yeah.
But
So
yeah, that was like
where does that land you now? Do you believe in God now? I realize it's a very
I
general, like
yeah,
what
yeah.
it means and everything, but
I I at this point I'm sort of like more apt to say like, well, I sort of don't agree with the premise of the question if someone were to ask me that. But I
right,
do
okay, yeah,
I do like believe that there is something more, something
cool.
meaningful to be had
But that
in life.
interpretation,
But
specifically Christian, and specifically what you grew up in, just too many, I guess, too many
it's
human inputs that were obviously warped towards.
it's complicated.
Yeah.
Because I still consider myself something of a Christian.
Hmm.
I don't know if I will ever move beyond that, and I guess I think I'm okay with that at this point.
Cool.
But I do think there's something compelling about the about the Gospel's account of this Jesus guy and his message and the things he
Yeah.
did in it, and there's really something compelling about the Bible, and it's something that I want to engage more in. I feel like at this point, like when you leave a sort of fundamentalist church like that, you go through like many people have attested to that fact that you go through phases, kind of like you do like when you mourn someone. You go through phases of grief and you know eventually at a certain point, most people reach a point of like distancing where they kind of just need to be away from religion for a while, away from faith, and kind of just like live their lives.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's kind of where I'm at, or where I've been at for a bit. But I do feel like this tug to like sort of re-engage with the Bible, re-engage with religion in a way that I feel pretty confident that would be meaningful at this point, but it would
Yeah.
be very different from what I grew up with.
Exactly.
I think that's as good a place to end as we're gonna get. Do you have any like closing thoughts before we sign off? Like anything you didn't get to, or any thoughts about kind of where you might go from here?
Yeah, I mean there's um there's a book that that I discovered through a friend of mine also leaving our church, and then her therapist recommending it, and then we read it, called Leaving the Fold. Um, I think the author's last name is Winnell, and it's it's like a it's sort of like a therapy book specifically targeted to people who leave fundamentalist Christianity. The fact that there is such a book testifies to, one, like the number of people who need it, who have left the kind of religion and have a hard time dealing with the other side, and two, like the fact that it's hard, and that it's something that people need help with. And there's something like when you leave the Church of God, that I left, pretty soon you will find a couple websites in particular that were made by people who left this church and need a place to just vent and share their anger and their grief together and tell their stories of, whatever it was, abuse or manipulation or frustration, and also like joy and stuff too. And like, it's, if anyone like who ends up listening to this is like either coming out of a situation like that, or in a situation like that, like the idea that you're not alone and that you're normal and you're okay is really important to remember, because really, like, the way, and this is not unique to um, evangelical fundamentalism by any stretch of the imagination, but the main way that people are disciplined to stay and not leave when their consciences are begging them to is this really intense um, method of cultivating shame in people and a fear of shame. And for me, like that is still like an obstacle to living. Like, it's I'm thankful that I have a therapist now, but like but like
No, that's real
the
for sure. The leftover bits that are just part of you that you can't ration your way out
oh
of.
yeah,
They're just
well, because you sort of build up, at least I did, build up almost a coping mechanism where there's a voice in my head telling me all the things I'm guilty for at any given point, and all the things that I should be doing and not doing. And it keeps it, and I can see now, like I couldn't see like when I first left, or even when I was growing up, that voice is meant to keep me sort of safe in an environment, like an emotionally sort of hazardous environment, in order to keep me from sort of appearing like I don't have any shame or that I don't feel guilty in an environment where it's really expected, and that if you don't accept that, then you're labeled as prideful or presumptuous or whatever. And that's like that's a really sad thing to me about about the experience that I had and about like fundamentalism, maybe more broadly, is just that there's a lot of, in any group like that, there's a lot of joy to be had and a lot of like, um, cohesion that comes through shared teachings and shared stories, even if they are, kind of horrible when you look closely at them. Um, but like, but you see what the consequences are if you try to stray, too far away.
Mhm.
And
Um,
even when I was convicted there before leaving, that I had to leave, that my conscience demanded that I separate myself from this church, you know, to try to find a more authentic Christianity. Even I there was still this like really powerful voice saying, you can't leave. If you leave, you're doomed. You can't leave. If you leave, you're being prideful and unreasonable. There's no justifiable reason for leaving, et cetera, et cetera. And like, and so it feels like weird to like, it was kind of a hard break at the end, but it almost feels weird to describe it that way, because emotionally it was not. Emotionally
mhm. Oh, absolutely.
it was like walking away but being tethered still with this, emotionally and psychologically. And that's been kind of a challenge, that the progress has been much slower, but I, it's definitely doable and worth the fight, I think.
Hell yeah.
Yeah, good luck going forward with that. So
Thank you.
yeah, thanks for all that. Uh you definitely had a lot to talk about, and I'm sure you could have gone on for a few more hours. We'll have to do Jedd part 2 in
Yeah, I'm into it.
future. So yeah.
Nice.
All right. Thanks.
Cool. Thanks for having me on.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for telling us about stuff.